Today is Easter Sunday, as I'm recording this. So I'd like to wish a happy Easter to all my Christian friends out there. And to everyone else, regardless of whether you have a faith or not, I would also like to send my best wishes for a new day. Because it is a new day. We've never had this one before. So it's brand new and we've got to live through it, and I hope that it's a good one for you. It is a sad time. And it's a worrying time. So, I'm decided that, seems it is Easter, I'm going to tell you, and it's kind of an Easter story, but it's kind of not as well, because it's a Viking story from the sagas. And it's about an Earl of Orkney, and a battle that he fought at Easter time. It's called Sigurd and the Raven Banner. Now, Sigurd the Stout, Sigurd Digri, became the Earl of Orkney around 995. Bit of a discrepancy about what the date was, but it doesn't matter. He became the Earl of Orkney anyway. And he not only ruled Orkney and Shetland, but he had lands in Caithness as well, and Sutherland. He owned ruled part of the north of Scotland. Now the King of Scots wasn't happy about that, of course, because he claimed the land too, and there was always disputes between them. Now there was an earl in Caithness called Finleik, and Finleik had said that he would meet with Earl Sigurd at Skittenmire in Caithness, and they would fight a battle to decide who ruled Caithness. Well, Sigurd had to accept. But he was worried because he knew that the Caithness army was going to outnumber his own army from Orkney by a considerable odds. It was not going to go easy. So he went to see his mother, Ethne, who was a woman of noble birth from Ireland, but also had a reputation for sorcery. She was a wise woman, a woman who knew a thing or two. And he told her the position he found himself in, that Earl Finleik had called him to fight at Skittenmire, that the army would be greatly outnumbered. And could she do anything to help him tip the balance of power in his favour? Anything that could help him? Well, she looked at him with a cold eye, and she said, "Had I known you'd want to live forever, I would have reared you in my wool basket," she said. "To think that you can control the fate over your life." Well, he wasn't very happy at those words, but she said, "Here, take this, I've made it for you with all the skill that I possess woven into it." And she gave him a banner. It was a raven banner, a red banner with a black raven on it. And the raven looked like it was in flight. And it was embroidered and stitched with magic woven into it. She said, "Take this with you, and it will bring victory to the army that bears it. But it will bring death to the standard-bearer who holds it." So Sigurd took the banner, and he marched off to Caithness. He sailed across the firth, and they rode down to Skittenmire, and they met the Caithness army, which was much bigger than the Orkney one. And the two sides fought. It was a hard, bitter battle. And the standard-bearer was killed. And another one took his place, and he was killed. And another one took his place, and again he fell, before Sigurd won the victory of the day. Now it was said that the raven, of course, was synonymous with the god Odin, and that Odin demanded a sacrifice, and so the standard-bearers were his sacrifice. Now he rode back, sailed to Orkney in triumph. They had secured their position in Caithness. Now, time passed. Sigurd had many more adventures, but there's no time for them all here. Now, it was Yule time in the year 1013, and they were all gathered at the big drinking hall in Bursey, and they were feasting and drinking, celebrating the Yule. And Sigurd had a powerful, an important guest there, because King Sigtrygg Silkbeard from Ireland was there too. He was a king of the Vikings in Dublin. But he was a troubled man. Now, his mother, who was called Cornlaud, she was a very beautiful woman, and she had been married to the High King in Ireland, Brian Boru. But the two of them had fallen out. And so Sigtrygg had gone from being the stepson of the High King of Ireland to being just the king of a ragtag band of Vikings in Dublin. And he wanted to fight Brian. He wanted to defeat him, kill him, and claim the lordship of the kingship of Ireland for himself. Well, to do this, he needed support, and that's why he was in Orkney, drinking Sigurd's ale. He said to Sigurd that if he would supply an army and lead it himself, come to Ireland and fight against Brian Boru, then he would give him his mother Cromlid's hand in marriage, and also he would make him the High King of Ireland. Now, this appealed to Sigurd, who was always an ambitious man, and he decided that, yes, I could just see myself as a king. It's good being a jarl, but it would be better to be a king. So he agreed. Now, Sigtrygg was not the sort of man that you would place much faith in. You couldn't trust him that far, and he liked to hedge his bets. So he set sail to the Isle of Man, where there was 2 Vikings who worked together in partnership. The main leader was called Broder. Now, he had been a consecrated mass deacon, but he had abandoned Christianity and gone back to the old religion, and he had become a powerful sorcerer. He had a magic cloak that he could wrap himself in, which was impervious to any weapons. Now, his partner was a man called Ospak. And Ospak, although a pagan as well, he was a very wise man. Not that I'm saying that pagans aren't wise, but he was regarded as a very wise man, very thoughtful, and very fair. Now, he commanded 10 ships, while Broder commanded 20. King Sigtrygg went to see Broder, and he made him the same promise that he had made to Jarl Sigurd Diggory in Orkney. He would marry his mother off to him, and he would make him the High King of Ireland in place of Brian Boru if he would bring his men to fight. Well, Broder agreed and accepted it. Now, that night, a strange thing happened. There was a terrible noise rent the air, and it started to rain. But it rained blood, boiling hot blood. The men on Broder's 20 longships, they were hit by this terrible storm. Ospak's ships weren't. But it rained red-hot, boiling hot blood on the people on Broder's ship, and they tried to cover themselves as best as they could, but many of them were badly scalded. And this went on all night until dawn, and then it stopped. And they found out that 1 man in every one of the 20 ships had died. Now, the next night, again, the same terrible noise rent the air. But this time, all the weapons chomped up alive and started to fight among themselves. And then they turned on Broder and his crew. All the Vikings were attacked by the weapons. They tried to defend themselves as best as they could. And this went on all night until the dawn as well, and when the sun rose, all the weapons fell down to the decks of the ships again. Now, on the third night, again, a terrible noise rent the air, and monstrous ravens came flying down, huge, evil-looking beasts, and their beaks and claws were made of iron. And they attacked the men. They defended themselves as best as they could, but again many men were badly wounded. And in the morning, when the sun rose and they disappeared, one man on every ship was dead as well, just like the 2 nights before. Now Broder went to see Ospak and asked him what these portents meant. Now Ospak knew that he was not going to like the answer that he would give, but he also knew that Broder had many strange little superstitions, and one of them was that he would never fight at night. So Ospak delayed interpreting these terrible scenes until the sun had set. And then he said to Broder, "The terrible noise that you had on the 3 nights is like the end of the world that is coming. And the first night, with the blood, that symbolized the blood that you would shed and would be shed by you and your men in the battle that is coming. The second night, the weapons fighting each other, that represents the terrible battle that you will take part in. And the third night, well, you will die in that battle, and those monstrous ravens with the iron beaks and claws were the demons that would fly down to carry your soul off to hell." Well, Broder was furious with this interpretation, and he would have killed Ospak on the spot if it wasn't for the fact that the sun had already set. So he returned to his ship, but he decided that in the morning he would attack Ospak and his ships. Well, Ospak knew that the attack was coming, and during the night he cut the ropes to all of Broder's longships, and in the confusion him and his men slipped out in their 20 longships, and they went to Dublin, and they went to King Brian Boru, and they received baptism from him and converted to Christianity. And they offered the king their swords. They would fight for him in the battle that was coming. They told him about Broder. They knew that there was someone, that King Sigurd Selkie was raising an army to fight him, and that they intended to arrive in Dublin on Palm Sunday. Now, back in Orkney, preparations were being made for the battle that was coming. Among the men that Sigurd had there was an Icelander called Thorstein Siduhalsson. He was a poet, a great poet, and actually a man who would warrant having his own saga in Iceland as well. Now, there was an old man there as well. He was a nice old guy called Harek. He was a loyal warrior to the Earl. He had fought with him since the Earl was just a lad. And he was out sharpening his sword and sharpening his spear, ready for the battle to come, and the Earl said to him, "Harek, what are you doing, old man? What are you up to, Greybeard?" "I'm getting ready for the battle," he said. "Oh, Harek, you're too old to come to battle with me now." "I am never too old to fight for my lord," he said. "Well, I think on this occasion it would be best if you would stay back here. Well, the old man was crushed. He was hurt. He wanted to fall in battle alongside his Earl, the Jarl, as they called them in the Viking Age. And Sigurd could see that he was upset. And he said, I'll tell you what I will do, Sigurd. I'll tell you what I will do, Harik. I will make you a vow. You will be the first person in Orkney to hear of the fate of the battle. They prepared their longships and they set sail, and they arrived in Ireland on Palm Sunday, and they began to prepare for the battle. Broder and his 30 longships of warriors were already there before them. And they got together and they started to work out strategies and what they should do. Now, the thing is, Broder was well steeped in the black arts. Black magic was his forte, and he was able sometimes to prophesize things. And he said that if they fought before Good Friday, all of them would be killed. If they fought on Good Friday itself, which that year, 1014, was on the 23rd of April. If they fought on Good Friday, then King Brian Boru would die, but his side would win the day, and they would all be killed. So, his advice was fight after Good Friday. But they were in such a hurry they wouldn't. They decided to draw up their armies, and also Brian Boru's men were drawing up as well for a battle on Good Friday. Now, with it being such a holy day, King Brian Boru, who was a devout Christian, would not fight on such a holy day as that. And so he stayed behind his shield wall at the back of the army, well out of way of the fighting, and he prayed there all day. Now, the two sides joined in battle, and they fought hard. It was a vicious fight. Sigurd led the men vanguard. He was in the centre of the army, leading it. On one side was King Sigtrygg Silkbeard, and on the other flank was Broder and his men. And they charged and fought hard. Now Broder, using his magic skills, cut his way through the Irish army until he got near the shield wall behind which King Brian Boru was being protected, where he was praying. Now, wearing his magic cloak that made him impervious to weapons meant that he hadn't been wounded, but he got up against a huge warrior called Wolf, and he was a brother of Brian Boru. Now, he couldn't stick him with his sword or his spear, but he was able to knock him down. He smashed him down 3 times. Broder went sprawling on the ground, landing on his back. This was a huge, powerful warrior, and Broder's heart failed him. He was a great bully and a bit of a psychopath, but still he knew that he'd met his match with this huge, strong warrior, and he fled into the woods and hid with some of his men. Now the battle went this way and that, but it ended up that Sigurd's side looked like it was coming off the worst. A standard-bearer had been killed, and Sigurd had ordered another man to pick it up in his place. The second standard-bearer was killed, and he ordered a man called Raven the Red. He said, "Pick up my standard." Now there was an old man called Amundi the White who was there, and he said, "Don't touch it. That is cursed and costs the life of the man who holds it." And Raffin the Red said, "Earl, bear your own devil." And he refused to pick it up. "Well," said Sigurd, "it looks like the beggar and his bag must stay together." So he unpicked the banner from the pole it was attached to, and he rolled it up and he hid it under his cloak. Well, soon after that he was run through with a spear and killed. And after that it was a rout. The Viking army that he had led, and that Broder and Sigtrygg Silkbeard had led, were defeated. And at the end of the battle, King Brian Boru's men were going around and they were picking off the survivors that were left. Thorstein Sidohalson, the poet, was there. And a foster son of King Brian rode up, and he saw the Icelander standing there, just as unconcerned as if he was at the fair, and he was tying his shoelace, just casual-like. And the king's stepson said, "Why aren't you fleeing?" And he said, "Well, there's no point. I can't get home tonight. I live in Iceland." Well, he laughed at that, this foster son of King Brian. He laughed at that and said, "Well said," and he spared him his life. In fact, he took him back to his hall and feasted him. He had spoken well, he had shown courage, and he was shown respect as a result. Now the battle was won, and King Brian had won the day. He was still at prayer in among the woods. But Broder and his men were still hiding in the woods. They hadn't been found. And he saw that many of the king's bodyguard had slipped away to pick off the survivors, and also, I suppose, to loot the battlefield as well, to loot the dead. So, there was the king, lightly guarded, praying on his knees. And Broder and his men charged out of the woods, and Broder swung his sword and cut off King Brian's head with one slice. Now, King Brian's men rushed back, including his foster son and Ulf, his brother, and he ordered that Broder should be taken alive. Broder's men were all killed to the man, but they pressed against Broder, using branches of trees, until they pinned him down so that his arms were down by his side. He couldn't fight. And they took him forward unarmed, and Ulf, the king's brother, decided his fate. And, oh, it was a cruel fate. He slit open Broder's belly, and he drew out his intestines, and he fastened them to an oak tree. And then Broder was led around and around and around the oak tree until all his guts were unravelled and knotted around the tree. And it was only when the last of his intestines were pulled out that Broder died. Now it was said that King Brian was so holy that when they carried his head to him and they put it back on his neck, it reattached itself, and he became whole again, and was buried with great ceremony after that. Now strange things were seen to happen after that, and during the battle. There was a man in Caithness called Dorad, and Dorad saw 12 people riding towards a small hut out in a moor. He saw that these were women who were riding there, and this hut was used by women for weaving cloth in. They would all work there together, working the wool, spinning and weaving cloth. And he went to have a closer look, and he peeped in through the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The 12 women that were there, they were beautiful women, but they were awful to behold, because they were the Valkyries, the handmaidens of Odin, the choosers of the slain in battle. And they were singing a song as they wove. And what they were weaving was no ordinary cloth, and what they wove it on was no ordinary loom either. The loom was made of 2 spears driven into the ground for uprights, and the women were weaving human guts, weaving a gory web of war. They used an arrow as a shuttle, and a sword as a weaving batten. And as they wove this, the warp was held in place, weighted down with human heads. Human heads were loom weights. And as they wove, they sang a terrible song, a song of battle. And they directed the course of the battle. In their song, in their weaving, they decided the fate of the warriors who were taking part. Who would live, who would die, who would win, who would lose, and who would be chosen to go and sit at the halls of Valhalla and wait the day of Ragnarok, when they would be put to battle again. When they had finished, they all tore a piece of this terrible cloth. They tore it to pieces, so they all had a piece each. They left the hut and they rode away, all in different directions. Dormad went back and he remembered the song and he sang it. And you know, people in North Ronaldsay could still recite that song in the late 1700s. Now, back in Orkney, they didn't know what had happened in the battle, of course. But the old man, Harrick, he could see in the distance men riding on horseback towards him. Who could it be? It was too early, surely, for the return of the army. He looked and saw that there indeed was his lord, Sigurd the Stout, Sigurd Digri, Jarl of Orkney, was riding towards him with his army behind him. Harrick took a horse and he rode out to meet Sigurd, and people saw them meet. The horses stopped. They could see the two of them talking. They talked together for a short time, and then they turned their horses, and Harrick rode alongside the earl, and they rode behind a hill, and were never seen in Orkney again. It was a ghost army that had returned, and Harrick had been informed that Sigurd the Powerful had kept his word. In Orkney it is believed that seals can take the form of humans. There are stories about this, and there are songs too. And this story that I'm going to tell you was originally an old song, an old ballad that would be recited many, many verses long. And I've turned it into a story again, because it probably started off as a story before it was a song. But it's called Lady Odivere. Now there was a woman who lived in Norway who was very, very beautiful and very, very rich. She lived in a fine castle, had servants, had everything that she wanted. She also had things that she didn't want. Men, lots of them, turning up trying to woo her, trying to make her marry them. They were all wanting her because of her beauty and also because of her money. And she had no time for them. She would send them packing with a flea in their ear, tell them to go home and mend the clothes that they'd worn out on their wasted, useless journey to go and try to woo her. She wasn't interested. And the people went back, all these men, and they were not very happy, of course. And some of them had travelled over the sea, and some of them had travelled a long way over land, but they all got the same answer. Now there was a man called Odivere, who was a warrior, and he also dabbled a bit in the black arts, things that he shouldn't. And he'd heard about this beautiful woman and her wealth, and he thought, I will make her my wife. I am determined that she will be my wife. I will have her. Where other men can't, I will have her. And he went down on his knees, and he swore the Odin oath that he would have her as his wife. Now it's a dangerous thing to swear by him that hung on the tree, because Odin is a fickle god, and he may grant you your wish, but only for a certain time, and it will always end in tragedy. But Odin intervened, and Odivere went to see the lady. And when the lady saw him, and he was a fine, handsome knight, she felt a stirring in her that she hadn't felt before, not for any of the other men anyway. And so when Odivere proposed, she accepted, and the two of them were married, bound together by the Odin oath. Now Odivere lived in the castle where the lady lived, her castle, and he had many warriors about him, and they would go off riding during the day, they would go hunting, and they would come back at night, and there would be feasting and there would be drinking. Every night they drank. Every night there was songs and music and stories being told. But after a while of this, Odivere got bored. He was fed up with sitting at home and hunting and feasting and drinking. He wanted something new, a change of scenery. So he decided to join a crusade, go to the Holy Land, fight there, make some money for himself too, and a reputation. So him and his men prepared. He kissed Lady Odivere goodbye and told her to look after the castle and everything for him until he got back, and he rode away. And Lady Odivere waited, and she waited. Every morning she would comb her hair and wash, and she would go up to the battlements of the castle, and she would look out over the land and towards the sea to see if there was any sign of Odivere coming back. But there never was. Those days turned to weeks, the weeks turned to months, the months turned to years, and there was no sign of him, and no word from him either. Not a message, nothing. She didn't know whether he was alive or dead, and she sat there lonely in the castle. She had her servants, but they were servants, they weren't really friends. And she just had a sad, sad life, lonely, bored, and incomplete. Now one evening, after sunset, a knight walked up to the gate of Odivere's castle and knocked on it. A very loud knock. The porter came to the gate and said, "Who is it? You can't come in at this time of night. Sun has set, and the lord of the castle is away, so there is no way that we could let you in." "Let me in," he said. "I am a knight. I am tired. I am hungry. I need a bed for the night and a meal in my belly. And another thing, tell Lady Odivere that I have word of her husband." Well, that was a different story. The gate was opened and the knight was allowed in. He was led up to the hall where Lady Odivere sat. and he was tall and strong and very, very handsome. All the ladies in the castle there, when they saw him, their hearts fluttered. He was magnificent. Well, he walked up to Lady Odivere, and he kneeled in front of her, and he said, "My lady, I bring word from your husband, and a token." And he placed a gold ring on her lap. And when she saw that ring, the blood drained from her face. She went as white as a cloud. Now, the knight spoke to her, but she never heard a word he said. All she could do was stare at that ring. Now she covered her face so that the people couldn't see that she'd gone white. They couldn't see the shock on her face. But then that passed. The colour returned to her cheeks, and she was able to talk to the knight, and she said, "Prepare a feast." So a feast was prepared. Ale and wine was poured, and it was a happy gathering. And the strange knight, he had many stories about Odivere and all his exploits. He was now a wealthy man. He had gathered a great fortune, and the last that he had seen of him, he had gone to Miklagard, the big city, Constantinople, as it was known, Istanbul, as it is now. But he had been there, and he had been feasting, and he'd been drinking too, and the knight rather let slip that he had no problem finding ladies. There was plenty of women around, and he was all too keen to chase them. Well, Lady Odivere listened to all of this, but kept staring at the knight. And when people got tired and they started to go off to their beds, it ended up that at the end of the night there was only Lady Odivere and the knight left. And when they were alone and they knew that there was no ears listening, she said to him, "Why did you come here tonight? And why did you give me that token?" "That was the token you gave to me long ago," he said, "when we were lovers. When we were in love and intending to wed, you gave me that." "I know I did," she said. "Well, you know," she said, "that I'm married now, and I have a good husband." "He is not a good husband," said the knight. "He cares nothing for you. He cares nothing for anyone but himself. He is false and treacherous and disloyal to you, and if you think otherwise, you're a fool." Well, they talked long into the night. "You know," she said, "you know it was the Odin oath that broke us apart. I loved you more than anyone else, and I would have married you. But the oath broke it. The Odin oath is so powerful you cannot resist it." They spoke again longer into the night, and eventually the knight rose from the table. He took Lady Odivere by the hand, and he led her up to her bedchamber. And the two of them lay all night together there. And in the morning, when she woke up just before dawn, the knight was gone. There was no sign of him. He had left without even a word of goodbye. Nothing. Now time passed, and it soon became obvious to everyone in the castle that Lady Odivere was pregnant. Her belly was growing. The question was, whose baby was it? I mean, it certainly wasn't Odivere's. He had been away for years. Well, when her time came, she gave birth to a fine baby boy. He was a beautiful, big, strong, healthy boy, and she loved him. and she would rock him in the cradle, and she would sing lullabies to him. And as she did, well, they were sad songs. She would sing, "Baloo, baloo, my bonny bairn, baloo lily, baloo lay, sleep you, my pretty bonny buddo, ye little ken your mother's way. Allure, I do not know your father, allure, allure, my woeful sin, I do not ken my bairn's father, nor yet the land that he lives in. Allure, allure, called shall I be a wicked woman by all men, that I, a married woman, should have a bairn to him I do not ken." As she finished singing, a voice from the foot of the bed said, "Here I am, your bairn's father." She looked, and there was the knight. "I've come back," he said, "to claim my son. I will come back in 6 months, and I will pay you your nurse's fee, and I will take my child away with me." "But who are you?" she said. "I don't even know your name." "San Imravo is my name, and I walk on the land and I swim in the sea. My home is Sulskerry, and where I live there I am the king of all the Selkie folk, and all the Selkie folk there have me as their leader by their own free will, and they all serve me and follow me. And my little son here will be my heir. I will take him to Sulskerry, which lies 30 miles off Orkney to the west in the ocean. I will take him there, and he will rule after me." "But if you take my son away, how can he be safe?" "He will be safe. He will be wrapped in his sealskin, the same as his father. We are of the Selkie folk. We are not mortals like you." "But my husband," she said, "he's a great hunter. What should happen if he comes back, and if he should kill my son, if he should spear him or shoot him with an arrow?" "I have no fear of that," said Sam Imravo. "I have no fear of that happening at all. I will protect him. Never fear." And so he disappeared, just as quickly as he'd come. And after 6 months he returned with a bag of gold coins for her nurse's fee, and he took his child, and Lady Odivere wept. Her heart was broken, and she wept for her child. Before the San Imravo took the little boy away and put him into the sealskin, Lady Odivere took a gold chain from around her neck. It had been a wedding gift to her from Odivere, and she tied it around the Selkie pup's neck and kissed him, and then they were gone. Now time passed, and soon a great horde of people, a great host, was heading towards the castle, and at the head of it was Odivere. He had returned from his crusade. And if the partying and the feasting and the drinking was great before, it was 10 times that now. That was all he had any interest in doing, was just sitting and feasting and drinking and boasting about all his conquests, of all the people that he had slayed, of all the money he had acquired, and also he dropped hints of the ladies that he'd bedded as well. And Lady Odivere sat there silently and listened to all of this, but said nothing. Now, after a while, Odivere got fed up with this feasting and drinking. He got bored again. And so he decided that the next day they would go otter hunting down by the shore. So the next day they got up, prepared horses, and rode off with their weapons to go and look for otters. Now, as he was down by the shore, there was a sudden splash, and Odivere looked around, and there was a seal pup, a very striking-looking seal pup, because he had black flippers and a snow-white body, and he was able to thrust a spear into that Selkie and kill it. And then he brought it ashore, and he stood there in shock, because around the Selkie's neck was a gold chain. He went up to the castle, furious. The rage and the anger was building up inside him like a volcano. He came up to the door and threw into the hall carrying the dead seal pup and the chain. And he shouted, Lady Odivere, come down here and read me this riddle. Lady Odivere came down, and when she saw the seal pup, who she recognized because of the black flippers and the white body, she screamed and ran down the stairs and hugged this dead seal, and she wept over it, and she wept and she wept and said, oh, what am I born to see? My baby, my bairn lying dead here. Who killed it? My curse is on the man who killed my bairn. What do you mean, your bairn? Said Odivere. That's no bairn of mine. I think that you've been unfaithful while I've been away. I think you've been dallying with the Selkie folk. Me being unfaithful, she said, with you, with a whole host of horse and conquests that you've had and boast about, and you call me unfaithful? I was never unfaithful to you, he lied. Well, she snatched the chain from his hand, and she brought it down heavily on his head. He ordered his men to grab her and to take her away and lock her in a room. It was her tower room that had no windows. She was locked there, and the next day they were deciding what fate should befall her. And it was decided that she should be burnt at the stake. And so everything was being prepared for the next day, when Lady Odivere would be burnt alive. She sat in her room, alone, and heartbroken. Everything that she had ever wanted in life was destroyed, was gone. The husband that she had once loved, she hated, despised. Her bairn taken from her when it was just tiny, and now killed by this monster of a man who she was shackled to, bound to by the Odin oath. And then there was the man that she loved, the Selkie man, who wouldn't take her with him, even when she had begged him to take her with him to the Sulskeri. He'd refused. He said, you made your choice, and now you have to live with it. And all of these things went through her mind as she wept. And she called to the spirit, the ghost of her dead mother, and said, oh, I wish you were here now, to see the sorry state of your pity lass, who is now going to be burnt to ashes and cinders. Oh, just for one more hug from you, mother. That's all that I would ever want in the world. Well, the time passed. The day followed the night, and it was the morning of the execution, and a stake had been prepared and kindling wood had been brought to burn poor Lady Odivere, to end her miserable life. But San Imrivo knew what had happened, and he got all the Selkie folk from Sulskeri, all the ones from around Orkney, and they swam off to Norway. But they went through down into the North Sea, and they found lots of whales there, and they drove them northwards towards Norway. And soon a cry went up, there was whales in the Vos, there was whales in the bays, there was whales in the fjords. The whole place was full of whales, and they thought they would go down and try to drive some ashore to get the meat and the oil for their lamps. So they prepared boats, and they all set sail, Odivere and all his men, and they left the castle virtually empty. Now, no matter how hard Odivere and his men tried, they never so much got as much as one whale. They couldn't drive any of them ashore. No matter how much noise they made, none of the whales would respond the way that they were supposed to. And so they ended up, after a long day of rowing boats chasing after whales, they ended up with only a skinful of sore bones for their pains. Not one whale, not one bit of flesh, not one bit of oil for their lamps. Well, they turned around and went home. And when they got back to the castle, they saw the gates were standing wide open. All the doors were wide open. Odivere ran up to the tower where his wife was locked, but the door of that chamber had been smashed in. It was lying down on the floor in bits, and there was no sign of Lady Odivere. She was gone. Gone with her Selkie lover. Now, Lady Odivere, despite whatever faults she may have had, was still respected and loved by people in the castle. And they felt that Odivere's double standards was really not acceptable for somebody who was supposedly a lord over them. And they started to desert him. They left him. And in the end, all that he had left was just the contents of his wine cellar. And he would sit there alone, eating his meals alone, and drinking hard and drinking long into the night. But he had nothing now. He didn't have the woman that he loved. All his men that he had around him had all frittered away his money. So he had very little of that left as well, and his reputation was ruined. Nobody respected him. And he sat there drinking at night and thinking of the Odin oath, and knowing that you had to be very careful what you wished for from Odin, because he would make everything come true, all your dreams come true for a time. But in the end, you ultimately had to pay the price. What starts in pleasure ends in pain. What starts with love ends with loneliness, if you swear the Odin oath. Now, this is not a request show, but this tale of rather dark, gothic horror, I think really needs to be dedicated to my friend Anya King, and to Anthony and Jerry as well, who will be sitting there listening to this too, I hope. Hello, folks, I hope you're doing okay. She does like a bit of dark gothic, so here's a story for her. Now, it's a story that comes from the island of Papawestry, and it's about one of the Lairds, one of the big landowners there, whose name was Trail, Thomas Trail, in fact, in this case. And he lived at Holland in Pappy. Now, Holland is from an Old Norse word that just means high land. It's got nothing to do with the country of Holland. It's just the high land. It's on the highest spot in the island, although that's not very high, actually. It's quite a flat island. But this is the story of Thomas Trail, who was known as the Wicked Laird. They had an evil reputation, but he had an even eviler reputation than any of the rest of them. This is a story called The Wicked Laird. Now, Thomas Trail. Now, he was born in 1668, and he died sometime before 1745, so this story is obviously during his lifetime. Now, he was known as the Wicked Laird, and with some good reason as well. He was thoroughly evil. In fact, it was said that he was steeped in the dark arts, and that, at some stage, he had sold his soul to the devil. Well, time passed, and it came to the time when the devil could reclaim that soul of his. Now, one day, Thomas was sitting in his chair, quite happy in Holland House, when the devil came into the room. And the devil said to him, "Well, Thomas, I think you have something that belongs to me, something that is now ready to be harvested." It was always said in Orkney stories that the devil spoke with a very posh, well-educated English accent. Now, Thomas Trail looked at the devil and he said, "I don't think so." "Now, Thomas," said the devil, "don't play games with me. You know perfectly well to what I refer. Your time is up. You have to come with me down to hell." "I don't think so," says Trail. "No, I'm quite happy where I am, actually. I don't really feel like going anywhere." Well, a very black look crossed the very black face of the devil, and he said, "I am not used with people arguing with me, Thomas. You are coming with me, whether you are ready or not." "I don't think so," said Trail. And the two of them started to fight. They fought their way through the house, and they fought their way out into the garden and out into the fields. They were in a field called the West Park, and they were fighting there. Well, you know something? Thomas Trail was so evil, he beat the devil, and he drove the devil down through the ground back to hell. And they said that nothing ever grew on that spot again, not a blade of grass, not even a weed so much as grew on that spot. Well, if the Laird was evil before, he was even more evil now. And he grew in size, and he grew in evil. He was a huge man, and much hated. Now, there was one day in summer when all the crofters and the cottars drove their sheep down from the communal grazing from all the common pasture, and they would shear them. And it was at that time that the Laird would ride up on his horse, and he would choose the best lamb from among the flocks, and that he would give as a gift to his wife. It's strange to give a gift of something that doesn't belong to you, but as far as he was concerned, the crofters on the island were nothing more than sheep themselves. They were just cattle. They were his to do whatever he wanted with. He didn't care. Now, there was one lamb, a grey lamb, a beautiful lamb, a lovely, fat, sleek, big, healthy, wonderful-looking lamb that was far better than any of the rest, and the Laird spotted it, and he said, "That one. I want that Laird brought up. I want that lamb brought up to the house as a gift for my wife." Well, the lamb belonged to a Cottar. Now, a Cottar, unlike a crofter, didn't rent land from the Laird. They were given a scrap of really poor land, very stony hill land, heathery. They could scratch a living out of it, and instead of paying rent, they had to work for their services. For their rent, they had to provide labour. They were basically nothing more than slaves. And this poor man, well, his wife had died. He was a widower, and he was left with 2 very small children. And the only thing that they had in the world was 1 sheep and this 1 lamb, which he was going to sell and use the money to try to buy food to feed him and his children over the winter. Well, he went over to the Laird, cap in his hand, and he said, "Please don't take my lamb. Please spare me my lamb. My wife's dead, and I have 2 small children to support. And that is the only thing in the world that I have. That is all that stands between us and starvation. Please, please, if you have any pity in your heart, please leave us that lamb. Otherwise, there is nothing to stop me and my children from perishing in the winter time." "I don't care," said the Laird. "Why should I care if your brats die in the winter or not? I want that lamb, and I will have it, and that is final." And the man said, "Well, you can take my lamb, and you can take my curse with you. Your wife will never live long enough to see that lamb. And when you die, you will go to your grave without a drop of blood in your body." Well, the Laird just laughed in his face, turned his horse, and rode back up to the big house. Well, he went in through the door into the hall, and he shouted for his wife, but there was no answer. Thinking that this was strange, he went upstairs to her bedroom, and there he found her lying dead on the bed. Her body was contorted, and her face was screwed up in a look of horror and terror. Whatever happened, she died of fright. And so, a part of the Cottar's curse had come true already. She never lived long enough to see that lamb. But the Laird didn't mind. I mean, somebody died, fine, whatever. He wasn't caring. As long as he was all right, that was the only thing that really mattered. So, he carried on living for many years after that, growing blacker and blacker of heart with every day that passed. He was thoroughly evil and big. He'd grow bloated, stuffing his face, doing nothing. One day, it all got too much for him, and he died. And you know something? Nobody lamented. But a dead laird is a dead laird. And a body of that size, you got to get rid of it, haven't you? So the local carpenter was taken up, took measurements, made a coffin, a huge coffin. They said that it took 80 of nails to fasten the boards together. It was such a huge coffin. Well, the laird was put in the coffin, and the lid was nailed down on him, and it sat on trestles in the big dining room at Holland House. And all the lairds came, and their families came too. Why? Because they were friends? No. He had no friends. Nobody liked him. But there was likely to be a great feast provided. He was an important man, after all. So they came for the food and the drink that they knew that they were guaranteed. And the hospitality, they would get a bed for the night as well. All would go well. It would be well worth the trip. But nobody could mourn him. People racked their brains to try to think of a nice thing to say about him, but, nobody could. I mean, the one guy thought, yeah, well, there was that time that no, that wasn't him. So, they racked their brains, they couldn't think of a thing to say about him that was good, and so they didn't speak about him at all. But as they stood around the coffin in the dining room, sipping claret, they heard a noise, a strange, scuffling, scratching noise coming from the end of the room. And suddenly, two monstrous ravens burst out of the fireplace and into the room, and they landed on top of the coffin, croaking terribly from out of them. And they were attacking each other, ripping each other with beaks and claws. People were horrified. They shooed them off the coffin, but they just flew and perched on top of the mantelpiece and carried on fighting, croaking out of them in the most terrible fashion, and fighting viciously. And people knew that this must be the soul of the wicked Laird and the devil. The devil was trying to take him down to hell after all, but he was putting up a fight still. Well, they felt it was best to get it over with and bury him in the burial ground up at St. Boniface Kirk. So they lifted the coffin, and it was a fair weight, and they took it along the road. And as they went out through the open door, the ravens flew out in front of them, and they circled over the coffin all the way down to the kirkyard, fighting terribly, tearing each other with beaks and claws. And then they started to notice it. It was very slight to begin with, but there it was, a distinct drip, drip, drip of blood seeping through one of the corners of the coffin onto the road. The drip got faster. Drip, 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 drip. They sent a boy home to get a spade to cover over the blood in the dusty road. But that drip turned into a trickle, and that trickle turned into a pour. And so they said that by the time that they got the Laird down to the kirkyard, there wouldn't have been a drop of blood left in his body. And so the Cottar's curse had come true. Now sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And this is a story that I've told many, many times, and I do love telling it. And it's from a house in the parish of Firth. It's called Langalour. Langalour is one of those old-fashioned traditional longhouses that you find in Orkney. It had the barn was built on one end, and the house, the domestic house, was on the other end, and there was maybe a byre in between as well. And it had a fire in the middle of the floor, and it had neuk beds. Now, a neuk bed is a bed that is built into the wall of the house, and it has stone slabs on the outside of it to just allow a very, very small opening so that you could crawl in and out without letting in too much drafts. Now, in the room next to where the fire and the neuk bed was, there was another room, and it had a rounded wall built into it that had a stone shelf in it called the say-bink. Now, a say-bink was the stone shelf where the say sat. A say was a wooden tub that you kept the drinking water for the house in. Now, I was told this story quite a lot of years ago now, 25 years ago, during the Orkney Science Festival. There was a bus tour of vernacular farm buildings, and we ended up at Langalour. And right next to Langalour is the farm of Redland. And Ian Scott, the late Ian Scott, who was a lovely, lovely man, he came out to see us, and we were chatting away because we knew each other, and he said, "Do you know the story about the baby that was born here?" And I said, No, I haven't. And he told me this story. And I guess it's called the Baby of Langalour. Now, this is a true story, as I said. It happened in the late 1700s. That there was a family called Corrigal that lived at Langalour. And they were just a young couple, and they were expecting their first baby. And of course they were all excited about this, about the baby coming. Now, back in those days, there was no doctors. There was no district nurses. What there was the howdy wife. Now, a howdy wife had many different duties. She delivered babies, but she also tended to the sick as well, maybe reset broken bones. And she also was an undertaker. She would lay out the body, wash it and dress it in its shroud ready to be buried. So she took you into the world and she put you out of the world decently. Well, she didn't work on her own. Usually, when there was a woman going to have a baby, she would call on some of the other women in the neighbourhood, women who had had babies themselves, and they would all come and attend with the howdy wife on the young woman who was having the baby. Now, one day, the woman's labour pains started, and she sent her man down to get the howdy wife. The howdy went around the neighbouring houses and got all the women from there too, and they all gathered at Langalour. Now, the first thing that they did was anything unnecessary got kicked out the house. So the dog and the husband got booted out. Not necessarily in that order either. And him and the dog set off up to the hills and wandered around there to pass the time, worrying about how it was going back at the house. And he paced to and fro with his dog backwards and forwards for a while. And then he went down to the house. And the woman, there was a woman guarding the door to make sure that he didn't come in, and she said, "There's nothing happening yet, on you go." So he went back up to the hillside again, and he wandered around with the dog, and then after a while he went back down, and the woman at the door said, "There's nothing happening, off you go." So back to the hillside, and he wanders around for a bit longer this time, and then he says to the dog, "Well, you think we should go down now?" And the dog said, "I don't know, I'm a dog." So he went off down anyway, and the woman in the door is saying, "There's nothing happening yet, off you go." Funny, he thought. So he went and wandered the hill again, and he came down, and the woman said, "There's nothing happening yet, off you go." And he thought, "Oh, that's weird. Every time I come down here, the woman in the door seems to be getting a bit more drunk every time. The last time he went down, she didn't even speak. She just pointed in the direction of the hill, and off he went." Well, after another period of wandering backwards and forwards, killing time, he went back down to the house at Langalour, and it was a very different sight that met his eyes this time. The woman in the doorway was standing there in tears, weeping. "What's wrong?" he said. "What's happened?" She didn't reply. He rushed into the house, and there was the howdy wife washing the blood from her hands and saying, "Ah, well, bite. Never mind. You're young. You'll have more bairns." "What do you mean, more bairns?" "Well, the bairn was born deed." "Deed?" "Aye, deed. Dead, you know." "Oh," he said. "How's my wife?" "She's fine. She needs to rest, though. But she's fine. But like I said, you're both young. You'll have more." Well, if the thought had occurred to him, which back in those days it probably did, it was a dangerous time, childbirth. He had never voiced it. He'd never given it room in his mind to think about it, to dwell on this. And he said, What was it?" "Peetie lass," she said. "Peetie lass, a little girl. Oh, a daughter. I'd have loved a daughter. Where is she?" "Well, we pat the body through on the say-bink. That stone shelf I mentioned earlier." "Oh, well, I want to see her," he said. Well, you can't do that, she said. Why not? It's bad luck, she said. If a man sees a stillborn child, says the howdy wife, he'll never have another bairn, he'll be sterile after that. Rubbish, he says, I don't care, I want to see my bairn. And he pushes past her, and he went into the room, and there on the saybank, on the stone shelf, the cold stone shelf, lay a tiny little body. Just a tiny little scrap of humanity. And he looked at her, and the lump in his throat choked him, and the tears were brimming in his eyes, and he thought, poor wee thing, never stood a chance. Never felt the wind in her hair or the sun on her face or nothing. And then he noticed, wait a minute, that child's breathing. So he picked it up, and sure enough, the bairn made a slight movement, made a slight noise, but it was alive. He carried it through and gave it to his wife. She took it into the bed with her and warmed it up, and then she put it to the breast, and it sucked, and it was fine. And then they realized what had happened. You see, back in those days, not only was there no doctors and district nurses and stuff, there was no painkillers either. There was no epidurals, no gas in the air, no nothing, not even an aspirin. But what there was plenty of was good, strong Orkney home-brewed ale. So the lass was given strong home brew to drink to dull the pain. Well, the howdy wife and the other women, they're sociable creatures, you know. They didn't like to see the poor lass drinking on her own, so they were joining in too, drinking. And you see, all that alcohol in the mother's bloodstream was going into the baby, and when the baby was born, it was drunk. It was paralytic. It never moved, it never made a sound, not a squeak. And the howdy wife, who had had a few herself anyway, in a darkened house, you know, and very little windows in those old houses, just kind of went, ugh, another dead one, and dumph, dumped it on the stone shelf. And so the man saved his daughter, and she grew up, and she married, and emigrated to New Zealand. Now, the story doesn't end there, though, because many, many, many decades later, over 100 years later, sometime in the late 1960s, there was a knock at the door at Redland, and Ian remembered it well. His father went and opened the door, and there was a couple of strangers. "Excuse me," they said, in obviously an accent that wasn't Orcadian. And they said, "Can we have a look at the old house at Langalour?" "Sure," they said, "yeah, of course. Why do you want to see that?" "Well, we have an ancestor that came from here, Corrigal to name." "Ah, right. And where are you from?" "Oh, we're from New Zealand." "Oh, right. Ah, yes," he says. "And when did he leave?" "Oh, early 1800s. Yes, it all made perfect sense. So they went out, they showed them the place, and then Ian's father said, "Do you know the story about your ancestor's birth?" No, they'd never heard it. And it's hardly surprising, because it's not the sort of thing that you would have passed down in the family. And remember, this is in the days of like the great Georgian writers like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and all. And it's hardly the sort of thing that would make a very good BBC costume drama now, would it, you know? If your leading lady, the heroine, was to say like, "Oh, Mr. Darcy, when I was born, I was so pissed they thought I was dead." You know, I mean, it's not very good for trying to gain a husband back in those days. So it was never mentioned. But the story was passed down in Orkney from generation to generation. And so they heard the story of how their ancestor was born, and also how she was almost lost. Well, when they went home, they had with them more than just photographs, postcards, souvenirs of Orkney. They had a story of where they came from. And that, my dear friends, is the power of storytelling. This is an old Orkney story called Sati. Now, a long time ago, a good 300 years ago anyway, there was a man called Sati who lived on the hills between Stennis and Orford. They said his name, in Orkney in those days, Sati would mean salty, but this didn't seem to be why they called him that. They called him that because he was in league with Satan. He was, supposedly, a spaeman, a man who knew a thing or two, knew magic, could see the future. And what he did, what his reputation was for being able to find anything that had been stolen. Now, he had no more idea as to who had stolen anything than me or you, but his reputation was such that everybody believed that he knew. And so if something went missing, somebody would come by to see him, and he would always quiz them about who it was, who do you suspect, and when did you last see your chicken, and such like. And then he would make a declaration. He would say, I know exactly who stole your chicken. Go back and tell everyone that Sati knows exactly who did it, and unless he returns the chicken right away, then I will expose him in front of the whole parish. Everyone will know the thief among them. That was enough. That was enough to get anybody scared and bringing back what they'd stolen. So he relied on that reputation. But also he was fly. He was clever, he was cunning. And his foil in this was Mrs. Sati. Because whenever anybody came up to the house, and the reason why the house was built on the side of a hill in the first place was so that they could see the view, an uninterrupted view, and they could see anybody coming up to the house long before they got there. And if they saw somebody coming towards the house, Sati would hide himself in a little cupboard, a little built-in cupboard that you didn't see really when you were in the dark house. And he would stand in this little closet and he'd listen while Mrs. Sati pumped them for information. You've lost some money? Mercy, that's terrible. How much have you lost? Is that right? Oh, God save us. Folk these days, it's just no safe to leave anything around. When did you last see it? And did you see any strangers about the house or anybody? Did you have any visitors? Any suspicion as to who it might be? Oh, mercy, is that so? Oh, God, you don't say. Oh, you just can't trust anybody these days, can you? Well, Sati would stand there and listen, and he would get all the information that he could. And when he realized that Mrs. Sati had, exhausted the well, they had been pumped dry, then he would sneak out another little door that led to the outside. Now, Mrs. Sati was always apologizing. Her husband was never at home when anybody came. But he had been listening, and then he would make a big deal about coming in through the front door. Oh, there you are, said his wife. Well, you'll never get... you don't need to tell me, he says. I know exactly who's here, and I know exactly why they're here too. Lost money, and then he would give the exact sum of money, and the last time that the man seen it, and then again he would say, go and tell everybody that Sati kens, Sati knows fine who did it, and I'll expose them in front of the whole parish unless that money is returned, and it always was. Now one day, Sati ran into a real problem, because there was a laird, who had had a large sum of money stolen, £60, 300 years ago. That's a fortune. Well, the Laird didn't want news of this getting out. He didn't want people to know that he'd lost money. Mostly just to save face rather than anything else. So he told a servant to take a horse and to ride to Sati's house. But on no account was he to go in. He was to say that, tell Sati that a large sum of money has been stolen, and I expect him to come to the big house tomorrow morning at breakfast time, and then find the culprit. Well, the servant rode to the house. Mrs. Sati went out to greet him. "Oh, mercy," he says. "Where do you come for?" "I've come for the Laird. He's had money stolen, quite a lot of money, and he wants Sati to come to the big house tomorrow morning, breakfast time." And then he turned the horse. Well, Mrs. Sati grabbed the bridle to try to stop him. "Oh, you'll come in for a minute. He's no here just now, but come in for a cup of tea and we'll have a pity blather about this." No, he said, "I've under orders from the Laird," and he rode off. Well, poor old Sati, what was he going to do? He had no idea who it might be or anything about it. And, I mean, his reputation was on the line. If he couldn't find who had stolen this money, the cat would be out the bag. Everybody would know that he had no power to be able to say who had stolen anything, and it would show him up to be the fraud that he was. Well, this is how he made his livelihood. He would be ruined. So it was a very worried Sati that set off early the next morning to walk to the Laird's house. He got there and he was brought in and he was given some breakfast in the kitchen. A bowl of porridge was put in front of him. And he supped that. Now, Sati was worried. Like I said, his reputation was rested on this. And you know that when you see a swan sailing along on the surface of a loch, and it's just gracefully drifting along, effortlessly, but under the water, boom, 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 those feet are paddling like mad. Well, that was Sati. He looked calm and serene on the surface, but his mind was going boom, 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 like the feet of the swan. He was thinking what he could do. But there was one good thing about Sati. He was cunning. So, the Laird came to see him. He was summoned in front of the Laird, and the Laird said, "I have lost £60. And I want it returned, and I want it returned without a fuss. I don't want people knowing that I had that amount of money stolen from me. I'd be a laughingstock. No, you have to tell me who the culprit is." So Sati thought about this for a minute, and he said, "Well, I'll need a few things." "What's that?" "Well, I'll need a cooking pot, a large cooking pot that is used a lot. And I also need a black cockerel." "Well, okay, I can get you those things, no problem." "The a live cockerel," he said, "you understand, not a plucked and oven-ready one, but, a live cockerel. Yes, that's not a problem. And then I want you and all your family and all your servants to gather in the big hall here." So all the family and servants were gathered together there, and in comes the cook with a big cooking pot and the cockerel under her arm. And Sati took the big cooking pot, and he held the cockerel down, and then he put the pot over the top of it, so that the mouth of the pot was against the floor, and the cockerel was trapped inside. Now, this pot, as Sati knew, had been well used. That's why he asked for a well-used pot. And the whole bottom of the pot was sooty. It was all caked in soot from the fire. Right, he said, Laird, you have to start. Why? Why me? Well, just to show everybody that everyone is being treated the same here, fairly. I want you to walk 3 times around the pot. And then I want you, with your fingertips, to touch the pot with both hands, fingertips of both hands. If you are the guilty party, the cockerel inside the pot will crow, and then we'll know who the guilty one is. We'll know the thief, the one that stole your money. Well, the Laird wasn't convinced, but he walked around the pot 3 times, against the course of the sun, of course, because Sati was in league with the devil, and then he touched the pot with the fingertips of his 2 hands, and then Sati said, right, and now I want you to raise your hands and hold them in the air for a minute. So he raised his hands, and Sati had a look at his fingers, and all his fingers were black. They were sooty. And then the Laird's wife had to do it. And his sons and his daughters had to do it as well. Nothing happened. All the servants started from the butler down. All the important ones first. Not a thing. They all walked 3 times around the pot. They touched it. They raised their hands. Sati looked at the fingers. Black tips to the fingers. And then they got the other servants, the ones that worked outside in the stables and in the barn, and they all went around it, and then they touched it, and, then same thing, black fingers. Now, it had got to the stage where they had got most of the people had done this. There was just a few left, and Sati was starting to really worry about this. But he persevered. Another couple of servants who were just hired to work in the harvest, they walked 3 times around the pot. They touched it. He saw the fingers were black. And then there came a young man who had not been in the Laird's employment for very long, just a day or 2. And he seemed a bit hesitant. And Sati watched him with interest. But he walked 3 times around the pot, and then he put his fingers down onto the pot, and he raised his hands, and Sati looked at them, and the fingertips were clean. He hadn't touched the pot. You didn't touch the pot, he said. The man said nothing. Why did you not touch the pot? Were you scared that the cockerel would crow? Well, the man then admitted that yes, he confessed. He was the one who had stolen the money. And he was sent off to his room where he stayed to fetch the money and bring it back and give it to the Laird. Well, the Laird was furious with the man, but delighted with Sati. So instead of getting the law involved, this man just got a beating and was sent on his way. But Sati was rewarded with a large sum of money. And not only that, he had got something far better than cash. His reputation was left intact. This is a story from the island of Copinsay in Orkney. Now, Copinsay is wedge-shaped. So it rises up from the shore, a big, it's a reasonably long island. It's small, but it's reasonably long. And it rises up steeply, and then it just falls away in sheer cliffs at the back. And it has a lighthouse on top of those cliffs. And I remember when I was a boy, on a foggy night, you used to hear the boo, boo of the Copinsay lighthouse. And it had a strangely reassuring sound about it. And I actually miss foghorns. They don't use them anymore. But it was quite a haunting sound. Anyway, I digress, as usual. This story is called the Broonie of Copinsay. Now, a long time ago, there was one man, one farmer who lived on Copinsay, and he lived all alone in his nice little longhouse. Now, the old Orkney longhouses, they had the barn at one end, they had the byre, the stable, and the house that he lived in were all in one long building, but, separated, but it meant that you could go from one to the other without having to go outside in the cold. Now, this farmer was lying in his box bed, like a kind of a wooden cupboard with sliding doors on it, and he was lying in bed, and he wasn't asleep yet, but he was dreaming in his head. Not quite daydreaming, because it was almost, night, it was almost a real dream, but what he was thinking about was his girl, the woman who he had asked to marry, the woman who had smiled and accepted, and he was thinking about their wedding, and about how happy he would be to have somebody for company in the nights in Copinsay. I mean, he loved her too, of course, but he was lonely there on his own, and the pleasure of having the woman that he loved for company was just so strong. He was lying there thinking about this, and thinking how lucky he was, when suddenly he noticed something, a slight movement over in the corner by the door. He watched closely, and a creature came into the room, a creature the likes of which the man had never seen before in his life, because this creature was green and glowed with a phosphorescent light. He was short and squat, completely naked, and instead of hair, the hair that he had, or what hair he did have, on his head, which was flat and bald, but around the sides and on his chin there was hair, only it wasn't hair. It was seaweed. And he also seemed to be slightly scaly looking, more fish than human about him, but a human shape all the same. And he babbled out of him in some language that the man couldn't understand. And he was faced with this creature come in the room. And he thought, what can I do? What should I do? And then he remembered that the word of God in cold steel was a protection against any evil. So he reached up for the little shelf that was halfway up the box bed, and he took his cutthroat razor from the shelf. And also he had a psalm book under his pillow, and he took that out as well, and he chomped out into the floor, waving the psalm book in the air and cutting a circle in the air with the cutthroat razor. The creature just babbled away at him again and made no attempt to attack him, but it just stood there in the corner, gibbering away out of it in some language that he couldn't understand, babbling away. Now the man started to lose his temper a bit, because he could be a bit hot-headed, and he picked up a fire poker, and he threw it at the creature. The creature just deftly leapt to one side, and the poker hit the wall quite harmlessly and fell on the floor. He picked up the fire tongs and threw them at the creature as well, but again the creature just leapt to one side, and the tongs hit the wall and fell down next to the poker. Then he grabbed the crook from above the fire. Now, the crook is a chain with a hook on it that you can hook your pots and kettles to hang them over the fire, to boil or to make soup or whatever you were doing. So he took the crook from above the fire, but you see, he forgot that this was not cold steel. This was soft iron from the smithy. and he swung it at the creature. Well, the creature grabbed the iron crook and flicked it out of his hands and threw it into the corner of the room. Well, then the man lost his temper, and he set on the creature with his fists, and he punched it and beat it and slapped it until it squealed out of it and ran out of the door into the night. Now the man sat down by the fire just to gather his wits a bit. He'd got a fright. And also, as he sat there and thought about what had just happened, his blood started to cool. He realized that the creature had actually never tried to hurt him. It seemed to be trying to communicate with him, but he couldn't understand it. So he sat there for a while, quite calm now, quite cool. And eventually, the green head, the flat, bald-headed green head, with the seaweed hair around the sides and on the chin, appeared from around the door and started to chiver at him in a language that he didn't understand. But he sat there and listened. And the more he listened to the creature's speech, the more he could discern words in it. He could understand what it was saying. And what the creature was saying was that his name was Hugbo, and he lived in the sea. But he was fed up and tired of gnawing on dead men's bones, and he wanted to come and live on land with the farmer. And if the farmer would allow him to stay there, then he would do some work for him. He would turn the quernstone and grind out enough oatmeal for making the porridge in the morning. Now the man thought about this. The only thing that Hugbo asked in return was that he should get a bowl of porridge with some milk in it. The man agreed. I mean, why not? And, he had to work on that farm all by himself. And any bit of help would be much appreciated. So if somebody could grind out his breakfast oatmeal for his porridge, then he would be happy. So with that, he went back to his bed. And the creature set about turning the quernstone round and round and round, the little millstone, and he poured the oats through the hole in the centre of it, and the meal, the flour, came out the side. And in the morning, there was a little pile of it there, ready to make porridge with. Now, this carried on for quite a while. And some nights Hugbo would come in, and he would talk to the farmer. He could understand what he was saying now. He didn't always catch every word, but he usually could understand it. And Hugbo told him about all the things under the sea, the shipwrecks that he had seen, the wonders, the homes of the finfolk under the waves. All these things he had seen, and he described them in beautiful detail. But some nights the man was tired, and he just went to his bed, and he would listen to the gritty chuckle of the quernstone as it went round and round and round, grinding out the meal for his breakfast porridge. Now the man started to think. Hugbo was absolutely fine. He had no objections to him at all. But what about his future wife? How would she take to having this creature living in their home? He felt that time had come that he should go and speak to her. So he did. He took his boat and he went across to the East Mainland parish of Dearness, and he went to see his sweetheart. And he told her all about Hugbo, how they had met, and what he did for him, and the fact that he was very grateful to him for his help, and he was also grateful for a bit of company in the evening too. And he hoped that she would find it in her heart to find him quite acceptable as well. And she said, well, if you are happy with him, if you like him, then I like him too. I think you'd better come and meet him. He said, just to be on the safe side, I will come with you. So she went across to Copinsay, and she was introduced to Hugbo, who just stood there grinning away. Not a stitch on, flat bald head, seaweed hair around his back, seaweed hair on the chin. And she looked at him, and she didn't think he was bonny. But if her man thought that he was all right, then, there was something to be said for that too. And so the couple were married, and the farmer took his wife back to Copinsay. And he loved her, and he was happy to have her there, and she loved him too, and she was happy to be there as well. But three's a crowd, And she started to look at this creature, this Broonie, this Hugbo, who was helping out around the house. And she thought, it's not decent. He's stark naked, and I'm a married woman. It's not right that he should be going around in that state. It's quite disgusting. It's not on, it's not acceptable. He'll have to cover up. And she thought, God, that flat bald head of his is really annoying. I'll have to cover that up too. So she managed to get an old cloak with a hood on it. And she repaired it, she patched it. And then one night she left it lying on top of the quernstone as a gift for Hugbo. But it was more her way of saying, cover yourself up, man. Well, she went to her bed, and her husband were sound asleep when they were waking up in the middle of the night with the most terrible, heart-rending howling coming from Hugbo. And Hugbo was standing there holding the cloak in one hand, and he ran round and around and around the floor, saying over and over again, Hugbo's gotten a cloak and hood, so Hugbo can do no more good. Hugbo's gotten a cloak and hood, so Hugbo can do no more good. And with that he ran out the door and into the darkness of the night, and they never saw him again. You see, the deal had been broken. He got his porridge, he got his milk for the porridge. That was the deal. By giving him clothing, the deal was broken, and he had to return to his home under the waves. Now I'm going to tell you two Selkie stories. The first one is a classic. It's from the island of North Ronaldsay, the most northerly of the Orkney Islands, and it's set on a farm called Westness, which I know well. I worked there once a long time ago. Anyway, the good man of Westness was a handsome and prosperous farmer, and the neighbourhood girls, they all smiled at him and were nice to him because, he would actually be quite a good husband to land, they thought, but he had no interest in women at all. He totally disregarded them. He said that they were just a trouble and a nuisance to him, and he had enough problems in his life without having to have a woman as well to think about and look after. And the girls, of course, the local girls, they didn't like that one little bit. And they used to sniff and point their noses in the air whenever he went by. And they used to call him a very old young man. He was old for his years. Some of the older women just shook their heads and said, "Boy, you shouldn't be so disrespectful. You may fall in love yourself one day." Ha! Fat chance of that, he said. You should be careful when you say things like that, because they might just come true. Now one day he was down along the shore when he heard a sound of laughter and splashing of water. And he went along slowly, and he saw that there was a group of Selkie folk, and they were playing in the water, splashing around in human form, and some of them were lying sleeping on the rocks in sunshine, and others were running around in a shallow pool of water. Where they were, there was rocks, and at the one side of it there was deep blue water, but at the other side there was a shallow pool. And they were playing all around this area, and nearby to where they were playing lay their sealskins, all discarded, all lying on the ground. Now he knew that these were the Selkie folk, and a thought gripped him. If I could get one of those skins, he thought. So he very quietly crept up. They didn't notice him coming until he set off at a run, and he sprinted towards where the skins were lying, and he splashed through the pool of water. As soon as they heard him coming splashing through the water, they immediately grabbed their skins and they headed back to the sea. But he was just fast enough to snatch one up before its owner could get her hand to it. And he rolled it up and he put it under his coat and he walked home. Now, as he was walking, he could hear behind him the sound of sobbing, the sound of a woman crying. And he turned around and looked, and there was a Selkie maiden, the Selkie maiden whose skin he had. And she spoke to him and she said, "Oh, please, please give me back my skin. I cannot go back into the sea without my skin. If I don't have my skin, I can't go back and see my family again. I can't be with my own people. Oh, please take pity on me and give me back my skin. If you ever hope to have mercy in your life, then take pity and have mercy on me now and give me back my skin." He looked at her. She was beautiful, beyond beautiful. And he started to feel something that he'd never felt before in his life. There was a strange tickling inside his chest. His heart started to beat faster, to jump up and down a bit. And that feeling, that strange yearning, longing, desire started to burn within him. Oh, yes, he was falling in love. He had never experienced anything like this in his life before. But he knew what it must be. "No," he said, "I will not give you back your skin. You must come and live with me and be my wife." Oh, how the poor Selkie lass sobbed when she heard that. Her heart was breaking. She begged and she pleaded down on her knees. She begged to get that skin back, but the man could harden his heart at will. Her cries and her tears meant nothing to him. They washed over him like the sea washes over a rock and leaves it unmoved. Well, she had no option. She couldn't go back to the sea. She had nowhere to live on land. So she had to accept the man of Westness's demand. And she went and lived with him there and became his wife. Now, the time passed, and she had 7 children with Westness, as he was just known. She had 4 boys and 3 girls. And she was a wonderful housewife and mother. She was a wonderful baker, brewed the finest ale, could spin wool, and she was devoted to her children. She was a good wife and a good mother. But sad, so sad. There was a sorrow on her that you could almost taste. She carried grief in her heart. Her heart was like a stone. She grieved and she sorrowed for that lost skin. She grieved and she sorrowed for that lost life, living under the sea. And she grieved and she longed most for her Selkie man, her lover, her seal husband. Well, sometimes she would have a faraway look in her eye, distant. When you spoke to her, there was no answer. She was thinking of something a long way away, something very different from what any human could have imagined. And whenever she had the opportunity, she would go and sit by the side of the sea and listen to the sound of the waves. And occasionally, a great big seal, a big bull seal, would rise up from the sea, and it would bob up and down, upright in the water, staring at her, and she would stare at him, and the tears would roll down her cheeks. Now, one day, the good man of Westness got his boat ready to go fishing, and he took with him his 3 eldest sons, and they set off in the boat. Now the Selkie wife sent the 3 other children off down to the shore to gather some shellfish for baiting the hooks. So they were out the house. That left her youngest daughter, and she was left at home because she'd cut her foot a few days before, and it had turned septic. It was bielen, as we would say. So the mother had very carefully cleaned the wound and wrapped it in a bandage. And then she left the child sitting with her foot up on a stool while she started to clean the house from top to bottom. Well, at least that's what she told her daughter she was doing. What she was really doing was looking for her missing sealskin, her lost sealskin, her stolen sealskin. And she searched and she searched high and low looking for that skin, but she couldn't find the hiding place. Eventually, her little daughter said to her, "Mammy, what are you looking for?" "Oh," she said, I'm just looking for a bonny skin to make a pair of slippers for you, to help your foot to heal." "Aha, well, maybe I know where there is such a skin," said the wee girl. "Really?" said her mother. "Where?" "Well, you see, there was one day when Dad was in the house by himself, and he thought I was sleeping in the bed, but I wasn't sleeping. I peeped at him to see what he was doing, and he was searching below the roof at the top of the wall, where the roof and the wall meet. He was above the bed, and he took down a bonny skin, and he looked at it, and then he rolled it up, and he hid it back above the bed again, between the head of the wall and the flagstone roof." Well, as soon as the woman heard that, Selkie wife, she ran over to the bed, and she went under that slate roof, and on top of the wall head, there, hidden, was her skin. She took it, and there was a little cry of joy broke from her lips. But then she turned round to the youngest daughter, and she said, "Farewell to thee, me bonny piddy buddo." my pretty little child." And she ran out of the door, down to the sea, and with a cry of joy she pulled on the skin and she dived back into the sea. Now, as she entered the water, a big bull Selkie came swimming up to her, and there was a very tender reunion between the two of them. They were so happy to see each other. The tears flowed from their eyes. They were so joyful. But at that very moment, Westness came around the headland in his boat with his children, his 3 eldest sons with him. And the Selkie wife swam over to him, and she lifted the skin from off her face so that he could once more gaze at her face, and she said, "Good man o' Westness, farewell to thee. I liked you well, you were good to me, but I love more my man of the sea." And with that she pulled the sealskin back over her face, and the 2 seals dived to the bottom of the sea and were not seen again. Now, Westness searched for his Selkie wife for the rest of his life. He always wandered the shore and stared out to sea. But never again was he destined to see her beautiful face. Now, the second story is very short, which is why I'm just chucking it in here. It comes from the island of Sandy, where my father came from. In fact, it's in Bournemouth. It's the same parish he came from, not far away. So, there is 2 islands called the Homes of Ayr. So this is a story from there. It's called the Selkie's Revenge. Now, the crofters in Bournemouth could use the Homes of Ayr to graze their sheep on. You see, common grazing was getting to be scarce. Lairds were enlarging the fields, and common grazing was disappearing. It was being absorbed into farms. But the Homes of Ayr were 2 small islands, and they were only accessible at low tide. And even then, only at very low tide could you pass over dry food to them. Now, the farmers, all the crofters, they were driving their sheep out there one day to graze on the homes. And as they went out, one of them spotted down on the shore there was a Selkie pup, a grey seal in its white coat. Well, he said, "That would make a fine skin." "You can't touch that," said the other crofters. "You can't touch the Selkie bairn. I mean, that's the Selkie folks' bairn. You'll be in trouble if you harm it." "Ha, rubbish," he said. "That would be a grand skin, and I'm going to have it." And he went down to the shore, and he clubbed the poor wee Selkie pup on the head and killed it. And then he skinned it, and he brought the white skin home with him in triumph. Well, that night, a strange thing happened, because all that crofter's sheep on the Homes of Ayr disappeared. None of the other crofters' sheep disappeared. They were all marked so they knew who owned what. None of the other crofters had their sheep interfered with at all. None of them lost a sheep. But that man lost every single sheep that he had. And the crofters said, "Well, that's what you get for killing a Selkie bairn. And the Selkie folk have certainly had their revenge on you, boy."